Welcome to today's Explainer. Okay, we are jumping into some seriously deep philosophical territory today. We're going to unpack a super dense, heavily logical argument about the literal nature of the supreme being. So, if you're the kind of person who loves looking at ancient wisdom through the lens of pure, rigorous logic, well, you are in exactly the right place. Our source material today is an excerpt exploring the Swaninarayan Charita. And what's fascinating is that this text doesn't just throw out vague, abstract theological questions. No, it actually tries to answer them using a strict, step-by-step logical framework. We're going to break this whole argument down piece by piece, and we'll see exactly how centuries-old wisdom tackles the massive gap between the physical reality we live in and the metaphysical nature of its creator. If the creator is formless, how is the creation formed? That is the absolute core paradox translated right from our source material. And just think about why this specific puzzle has completely frustrated philosophers for literally thousands of years. It really just boils down to cause and effect, right? Like, how can a source that totally lacks any physical dimensions, no height, no depth, no actual matter, produce an end result that we can physically touch and see and measure? Grasping the sheer weight of this paradox is absolutely crucial before we go any further. It totally challenges our baseline assumptions about how reality itself even started. It really forces us to ask, how on earth can something entirely devoid of shape be the grand architect of a universe that is completely defined by shape?
Section 1. One Supreme Being, Many Names and Forms.
So, to solve this mind-bending paradox we just talked about, our source takes us right back to some foundational wisdom, basically setting up a baseline premise about the divine. The text references the Rig Veda, which is one of the oldest known scriptures out there, and it highlights this specific phrase. Scholars call one supreme being by different forms. Now, the absolute key word to focus on here is one. Right out of the gate, the source is establishing absolute unity. We aren't dealing with competing creators or some chaotic pantheon of gods. The text impartially asserts that despite the huge variety of names and interpretations recognized by scholars across different cultures, they really all point back to one singular supreme source. We're starting from a place of total unified origin. Basically, everything traces back to a single root. Moving on to Section 2, Question of Dispute, Why the Conflict? Then, the text poses this really fascinating, honestly kind of frustrating question. Where does the question of dispute arise? And it's a totally fair point. If all these brilliant scholars and ancient texts agree that there's a singular supreme entity at the root of the whole shebang, why in the world is there so much philosophical friction? It's kind of ironic when you think about it. We have these incredibly unifying ancient texts, but humanity still manages to just relentlessly argue about the theological details. The text actually suggests that if we truly grasped the unity of the supreme being, almost all ideological disputes would just vanish. There'd literally be nothing left to argue about. But as the source points out, there's still this one massive, polarizing debate that just won't go away. And it leads us right back to that initial paradox. Which brings us to Section 3, Formless versus Formed, the Great Debate. Okay, to really wrap our heads around the gravity of this source's argument, we have to precisely define the two opposing philosophical views exactly how the text frames them. So on one hand, we've got the concept of a formless creator, which the source's tradition calls Nirakar. This basically implies a divine source with zero boundaries, no physical body, no shape whatsoever. It exists completely outside the rules of physical geometry. On the flip side, we have the formed nature of existence, known as Sakar, and that is the universe we actually live in. Just think about the sheer physical density of our reality for a second. We're talking spinning galaxies, massive solid planets, incredibly deep oceans, right down to the complex biology of your own body. Every single tiny element of this existence has distinct shapes, boundaries, and physical forms. Notice the massive contrast here. A formless creator up against a formed creation. I want you to just hold that immense philosophical friction in your mind for a moment. We're essentially staring down this seemingly unbridgeable void. Like, how exactly do we get from a completely formless starting point to a formed reality? How does an entity with absolutely zero physical properties engineer an entire cosmos that is literally made of nothing but physical properties? It completely defies the basic logic of cause and effect that we see in the natural world every day. The source text totally recognizes this massive disconnect. But here's the kicker. Rather than just relying on blind faith to bridge that gap, it actually uses incredibly strict deductive reasoning to solve it. All right, Section 4, Logic of Creation, Solving the Paradox. This is where things get really interesting. The text applies a rigorous philosophical syllogism to essentially crack this paradox wide open. Let's walk through this deduction step by step, because it's like a giant puzzle. Step 1, the premise that God created the universe is accepted. Boom, the origin point is locked in. Step 2, we look around at our reality and acknowledge that the created universe unquestionably has a physical form. It is undeniably Sakar, it has shape. Now we hit step 3, the grand deduction. If the creation is undeniably formed, how can its creator possibly be formless? The logic here is incredibly direct, and it's deeply rooted in that principle of cause and effect. The text argues that a cause basically has to contain the potential for its effect. I mean, you can't give what you don't have, right? So if the output, our universe, has physical form and geometry and structure, then the input, the creator, must also inherently possess a form. According to the strict, airtight logic of this text, a completely formless source just cannot produce a formed reality. The creator has to share in the tangible nature of the creation.
Section 5. The divine form, a sense of wonder.
Now, after walking through that super rigorous logical deduction, the source material does something really beautiful. It pivots to this awesome exclamation, "What a wonderful description of the divine form." Having logically deduced that the Supreme Being must actually possess a form to have created a formed universe, the text doesn't just stop at cold, hard math and logic. No, it leans right into admiration. It celebrates this realization that the divine isn't just some abstract, empty, blank void, but rather an entity with a magnificent, tangible reality. It is a really fascinating shift in tone. The logic we just went through doesn't act like a sterile academic tool. Instead, it acts as this gateway to deep spiritual and philosophical wonder. The deduction literally paves the way for reverence. And that leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative thought derived straight from the source's logic. Think about this. If every single particle of creation around us, from the microscopic complexity of a single tiny cell all the way up to the vast, swirling architecture of a solar system, has a specific, intricate, and beautiful form, wouldn't the form of the one who engineered the whole thing be infinitely more complex and wonderful? It's a logical framework that completely flips the script on how we visualize the origins of everything. It suggests that physical form isn't some sort of limitation of reality, but actually a direct reflection of the divine itself. I really encourage you to keep chewing on this paradox and maybe consider what a wonderfully complex divine form might actually imply. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep questioning the logic behind our amazing reality.